Alright, y'all, so today I want to do a very quick review of Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, the final film in the Gamera Heisei trilogy. It was released back in 1999. Of course, it's a sequel, and the same director and I think maybe producers and writing team came back for this one. So, what was my overall thoughts on Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris? I gotta really say, man, this is a really, really solid and good monster movie. Now, I've heard a lot of praise about this movie after I watched it, and I think some of it's warranted. Admittedly, I do think there's a lot of cons to this movie. Is it better than Gamera 1? Well, for without a doubt, I think Gamera 2 is better than, or excuse me, Gamera 3 is better than Gamera 2 by far. Is it better than Gamera 1? I don't know. I feel like there's some elements of this movie that are overall brilliant, that are, leagues, like I said, leagues ahead of the original movie. But at the same point, there's just some elements of the original movie that do just, frankly, in my opinion, structurally work better. But that being said, overall, it's still a really good kaiju movie. It's a landmark movie, to be frankly honest with you, a testament of what you could do with a Japanese kaiju movie. So regardless, let's get into it. As always, I'm gonna get into my pros, my cons, and to give you my thoughts, like always. So for pros, this movie addresses one of the big problems I had with the last movie, which I really liked. This is more of a direct sequel to the first movie. Characters from the first movie, there was a scientist lady, can't remember her name, I'm gonna butcher her name anyway, but she comes back from the first movie, and it's great. She's a central character. The reoccurring ex-police inspector guy that did show up for a cameo in the second movie is also back and takes a much more central role this time around. At first, he's kind of like a homeless, defeated person, and then eventually, thanks to the scientist's help in the ever-evolving Gamera situation, decides to, help her friend, or his friend, and, make something of himself. And, like I said, this movie is much more of a direct sequel, which I really like. Things that happened in the first Gamera movie directly tie into this movie. One of the big characters in this movie is a female child, teenager, if you will. Her parents were killed in the first movie, the first Gamera movie, during the final battle between the Gaios and Gamera. And the resulting deaths, kind of led to her very much being embittered against Gamera, and eventually leading her to, summoning a creature that she called Iris in the film. And like I said, she's basically the central character of the movie. An interesting character because, like, she is at first the protagonist, but then eventually warps into the antagonist. But it's a really great thing, and it's all tied back to the first movie. And I just really like a lot of the reoccurring characters here. It just feels much more like a follow-up sequel to the original movie. And I think that overall, that's a huge improvement that this sequel has going for it. Also, in general, the story is fantastic, like always. I actually think the story is also, in general, much stronger than the sequel. I actually say on a more deeper level, at least character wise, this film is an improvement even over the original movie. There's very deep characters, there's very deep themes in this movie. I really enjoyed the story. Like I already mentioned, the revolving character of this student, this child who, hates Gamera for the events that happen and really deals with the consequences that these giant monsters have. Like I said, they're, ultimately saving the world, but at the cost of so many lives. And that impacts countless lives. This is, like I said, one of those examples. A female, student, if you will, she finds a kind of stone that's like accursed by the village, moves it, and summons a monster that she calls Iris that ultimately almost destroys the world. And she was probably going to let it happen because she was so consumed in revenge. And this movie is deep into themes of revenge, what that does to a person, how that determines and shapes a person's life, and ultimately overcoming that with forgiveness, which she kind of does at the end and forgives Gamera to a certain extent, realizing ultimately the quest for revenge ironically cost, who knows how many orphans from this situation, and, is ultimately, not, I guess, maybe not fulfilling, but just ultimately, a lot of people got hurt in the way in the process, which I'm sure was never the original intent. But like I said, really great stuff here. I really enjoyed the story this time around. The action is really good. The cinematography is top peak. Gamera comes back in this movie. He has a radically new design. And it looks pretty good. It looks more violent, if you will. It looks like more of an evolution of Gamera and like his life cycle, I'm just assuming, but it looks pretty good. Even the new monster, Iris, is really cool. He kind of reminds me of a lot of creatures from like Lovecraftian kind of vibes. Of course, definitely major anime inspirations here. Obviously, hence the tentacles. I wouldn't call him my favorite creature I've seen in the Heisei Gamera trilogy, though. I will say that what he represents is deeper and better than all the other monsters that we've seen. But I just do think that the Legion, at least in my opinion, I've always felt the Legion had the coolest monster design. But like I said, this is still a pretty cool design. It's very unique and interesting. The action itself, before I get off on another tangent, is really good. I really like the action. The cinematography is really good. I noticed too, the way it's directed, a lot of shots that are more angled up from the humans' perspectives. I always love when monster fights are filmed this way, just because you get the sense of scale and how truly massive these kaiju are. But the fights are really good. The CGI that's being used here, while you can definitely tell it's CGI, I do see it getting better, right? They do kind of mix in some CGI, especially with the other creatures like the gyro, also some more advanced effects. But like I said, while it's still noticeable, I wouldn't call it like horrible or anything. And like I said, it never substitutes for any of the real fights in the movie. The simple destruction and actions also really good, especially that last fight, that brutal last fight between Iris and Gamera. Really cool fight, but very brutal, and it's really cool stuff. Also forgot to mention as well, almost, of course, we have another reoccurring character, which is, of course, the female character that spoke with Gamera in the first movie. She appears here, so she appears in all three of the movies. And, like I said, I already mentioned this, but I like the story. I also like how closely tied it is. I also like the strong themes here, about forgiveness, about revenge. Like I said, the human element to it is tied directly to the destruction that the monsters are creating and as a result of it. And it's really, really good stuff. My favorite monster movies in general are the ones that try to go deeper beyond the surface level, monster destroying the city into disaster. While I very much enjoyed those movies, if it like a movie can kind of like, for the story and themes, go a bit deeper with a more of a psychological element to it all, maybe somehow tie it to like the humans somehow. Those are personally for me my favorite monster movies, because they represent something a little bit more deeper. For example, like this is definitely in my vein. And what really makes this movie really surprising to me, and what makes it stand out, I think there's other movies like Colossal. That's another movie. I Kill Giants, I believe. That's another one. I guess arguably Godzilla King of the Monsters, but I'm getting off on another tangent. Really cool stuff, though. Really cool stuff. In terms of other themes, I can say, there's also a slight environmental theme that's added to this movie, even though it's not as strong as the first movie. Because, like I said, most of the themes are taken back by this whole theme of revenge and forgiveness, especially with the sort of main character. It's still prevalent, especially with all these Gaios, that are happening. They kind of take over They kind of, pop up all around the world. And like I said, we know in the first movie, it's due to really bad environmental conditions that these creatures arise. And like I said, that's kind of a message on, global warming, climate change, destroying the environment. Really cool stuff. I really like it. There's also, like I said, a little bit of a magical, mystical theme here. It's implied that Iris, the creature's origin could be like a evolution of the gyro bats, which is, interesting. Even I will say that the creature doesn't really look anything like the bats, so I'm not quite sure about that. But like I said, a lot of it's remained ambiguous. But like I mentioned in my last review for Gamera 2, there's of course a slight religious tint to it all. Iris is kind of depicted as the devil, and Gamera is almost like a vessel. They describe it like a vessel of goodness or something. And there's also a little bit more hints of backstory because we find other dead, boned, kind of Gamera-like species under the ocean. Really cool and interesting stuff. And like I said, it gives more hints to the ultimate backstory of Gamera in this world, which is really cool. One of the things I also complained about in my last review, which, like I said, they don't really go into it too deeply, which I would have preferred if they did, but at least it's there. But yeah, now let's get into some of my cons. And I think, while I think this movie is really good, I do think there's some flaws with it. And keep this in mind, this is based on a first-time viewing, so take that as you will. That being said, I did think some of the more spaced out, high concept elements to the movie and maybe pacing were a bit confusing and not explained well. Because I think sometimes, especially if you watch it the first time, you will be a little bit overwhelmed as a viewer. I'm like, wait, so what's this? What's this negative energy mana? Because they kind of name drop that in the movie. And it's all these crazy concepts, and they don't do a really simplistic or, thorough explanation of it all. And I think the movie should have at least slowed down to help further explain some of these elements. Like I said, I think that kind of what makes this movie dip down a little bit in quality for me sometimes when I think about it. But other than that, and like I said, pacing, maybe the movie moves a little bit too quickly. I would have liked more explanation on certain aspects. Of course, more on Gamera's backstory. But other than that, I really don't have too many other complaints. A lot of my major complaints still were kind of addressed with the sequel. I just think that the movie kind of gets lost in the sauce sometimes when it gets into those high concept plot points and doesn't thoroughly explain them. That could have definitely been beneficial. But like I said, the strong themes, the interest, the really good action, the story, in general, just is a really good movie. So yeah, that's kind of my quick thoughts on Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris. Really good movie. I can't tell you right now if it's the best in the series, but it's a really great kaiju movie. Honestly, the Heisei trilogy in general is one of the best kaiju movie trilogies of all time. Each film has been, at the very least, really good, really solid. I haven't had huge complaints about these movies, and like I said, as a testament to their quality. I highly recommend not only Gamera 3, Revenge on Iris, but the whole Gamera Heisei trilogy. But yeah, my quick thoughts on Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, a really good kaiju movie. Hopefully you all have a good day, and peace, y'all.